matter how hard you try, you can't stop us now.
So again, I do think the book is well written. I learned a lot, but I also learned, and I was quite annoyed by these two pervasive lies that I saw in this book. And it's one that there's a racial component to the Jewish identity being white, and the second thing, which anytime any comparison to Christianity and Nazism is detestable.
To change, nothing stayed the same. There were always renegades like T-City Bull, Tom Hanks, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X was a renegade.
Everybody, it's Chicago talk show host, and I'm here with the book written by Murray Friedman, What Went Wrong? The Creation and Collapse of the Black-Jewish Alliance. And we're going to discuss some of the details inside this book. I picked up this book because I was listening to Dr. E. Michael Jones, author of Libido Dominandi, Sexual Revolution and Political Control, and Logos Rising, among other books. You can find his works on culturewars.com. And he had referenced this book. He had referenced this book in one of the things that he was saying. And I've had an interest in this sort of thing, right? I've always heard about this figure of Martin Luther King and his details, his story, and the people that were helping him, right? Who were these people that were helping him? What was necessarily in it for them? What kind of people were they? This became more pertinent to me as I grew up and I became an adult, and I started to really draw my own conclusions about Martin Luther King. I really like his approach of nonviolence, his ability to as an orator, his speech delivery, and his passion when it came to civil rights justice. However, I can't laud him too much personally because of his history and his checkered past with adultery, given that he was married and all kinds of infamous counts of adultery. To me, what that lesson means is that it's good to support your fellow man, but when you start believing in that man as being the answer or the solution or some sort of a god or demigod, I think that's when you fall into error, and you can be a victim of being deceived, and I think that's where a lot of people run in trouble. So I have tons of respect for Martin Luther King, but when it comes to supporting somebody who cheats in marriage, so that compromises it, and I think I see that as a compromise of his character, and which undermines the rest of his work. And so what I'd like to do now is I'm going to go over a select number of passages. There's about 10 of them. And so buckle in, and we're going to go over some direct quotes from the book, as well as I'm going to point out some. So the author is Jewish, and there's some categorical, either there were mistakes or outright lies about certain things that I want to clear up. And I'm going to get to that. I encourage you to read the book, and I encourage you to do your own historical analysis outside of the mainstream and make up your own mind. Draw your own conclusions and go from there. I do think that there is a bias written in this book. Anything this book highlights, this once upon a time history where they worked hand in hand to kind of achieve some mutual goals in regards to civil rights, and kind of how they one party kind of respected the other party, and the other party was just like, hey, we're fighting for a certain comeuppance in this country, in this pretty racist country back then, and we're trying to claim a stake too. Come along with us, and then things started to unravel, right? Both parties became kind of disillusioned with each other, and then both felt like each side was lacking respect and recognition for previous significant issues that had happened between them. So we're going to get started right away with the introduction. So here's the passage that kind of stood out and kind of set us a nice little introduction for this book. So Murray Friedman, he writes, in recent years, a seemingly endless series of conflicts has risen between blacks and Jews. These conflicts have received wide attention in the press and aroused real concern among Americans of every race and background. Episodes particularly distressing to Jews include the then presidential candidate Jesse Jackson's reference to New York City as Jaime Town, and his reluctance until very recently to distance himself from the bitter tirades of black Muslim leader Louis Farrakhan. The charges of a Farrakhan associate, Stephen Coakley, a Chicago-based researcher, that's in quotes, for the Nation of Islam and former mayoral aide, that Jewish doctors had infected black baby with AIDS, Spike Lee's portrayal of two Jewish nightclub owners as exploiters of black musical talent in his film Mo Better Blues, and the outspoken assertions of Leonard Jeffries, a black professor at City College of New York, that Jews financed the slave trade and conspired, through their control of the Hollywood film industry, to foster racist images of blacks. So the big takeaway from me from that first entry is the idea of, even in modern times, what we've heard maybe distantly or fairly throughout modernity, this idea of Hollywood having a certain association, right? And so when there's this quote, that Jews financed the slave trade and conspired through their control of the Hollywood film industry, end quote. So this sort of thing has been documented, to say the very least, and one should consider those implications if one hasn't already, right? Hollywood being this movie machine industry, right? And I know many of us have grown up watching all kinds of movies, and it can influence you, right? If something is shown to be cool or dangerous, you get certain cues from movies, right? And movies can impact culture. If there is a certain kind of culture being perpetrated in the movies, and that sort of message subverts culture in some fashion, people are going to get concerned. And so I think more or less this is something we've heard about for quite some time now, and it's up to you. It's up to you to draw up your own conclusions. For the second point that I wanted to talk about that stood out to me in this book is not only a part that stood out to me, but is something that we're going to address and correct. I'm not sure what the author's intention was, but there is a blatant what appears to be a lie, because it's reinforced in this book a few times. It's not just like an innocent white lie, so to speak. There's this sort of idea that's perpetrated in this book that is just not true. And so we're going to get into it. So for the second one, we start to learn about, through virtue of this book, I got to learn a great deal about a black man named Booker T. Washington. Pretty central figure in the beginning story of the civil rights movements, right? This is way before Martin Luther King or any of that stuff. And so the author writes, a central figure in promoting the idea that blacks should emulate Jews was the most prominent black in America of that time, Booker T. Washington, end quote. The author writes, what particularly impressed Washington was the pride that Jews took in their Jewishness, their faith in themselves, and the way they supported one another. We learned that, the author writes, Washington was careful to distinguish Jews from other European immigrants, whom he dismissed as beggars, anarchists, or superstitious peasants, unquote. We'll go on with Booker T. Washington. The author writes, the extraordinary strides Jews made in overcoming disadvantages gave Washington hope for blacks. He believed they could become the architects of their own future in the New South. He ignored, however, the major differences between the black and the Jewish experiences, including the long Jewish mercantile tradition, the important fact that Jews were whites, and as a result of this, the freedom of opportunity that Jews generally found here. The author continues. He writes, although Washington greatly admired Jews, he is reported by his biographer, Louis Harlan, as being full of misunderstandings about them. Harlan sees Washington as sharing the small-town American anti-Semitism of his day that identified Jews with the image of overpricing storekeepers and the usurious lender. Washington criticized Jews in some of his early speeches, but after affluent German Jews began contributing to Tuskegee and other black causes, he either discarded or concealed his prejudice. So with this second passage, what I'm going to do is break down a couple of things. One is this idea, which I think is a perverse lie at this point, that Jews are white. There's that the word Jew is synonymous with some sort of a racial trait or a biological trait, and that is not true. And I'm going to break that down in just a moment for you. The second thing that one should take note of, that I did when reading this passage, is the idea that, quote, but after affluent German Jews began contributing to Tuskegee and other black causes, end quote. So already we have this idea of money making the world go round, money being the root of all evil, doing what money does, which is to corrupt, and and paying people off, and what good can come from that? And now we're going to go over this sort of pervasive lie that's throughout this book, this idea that Jews are white. So the quote is, Murray Friedman writes, quote, "the important fact that Jews were whites," end quote. So we're going to debunk that. And I'm going to call upon one source, being Dr. E. Michael Jones. And so we're going to break that down. For a definition of the Jew, we're going to break down what E. Michael Jones has to say in his book, The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit and Its Impact on World History, which I'm reading right now. What's great is this book is already phenomenal, and I encourage you to read it as well. But we're going to go over chapter 2 of the introduction, Who and What is a Jew? Debate over the term. Now, I'm not going to go over the whole book with you, so I'm going to try to put a framework together in answering that for you by virtue of some of these bits from this book, all right? So E. Michael Jones, he begins with writing, "Debate over who the Jews are never ceases. Such debate comes up against a basic philosophical issue, something akin to the nominalism of William of Ockham, as in Occam's razor. The issue revolves around the use of the word, quote, Jew, end quote. Just what does the word refer to? Does it refer to anything at all, or is it like the word, quote, tree, end quote, a word which, according to the nominalists, has no clear meaning, since in the real world, the only thing which exists are individual birches, maples, etc.? According to this unwritten rule of discourse, the term, quote, Jew, end quote, refers to no category of beings in reality. Use of the term, quote, Jew, end quote, as a category is, as a result, ipso facto evidence of anti-Semitism. This reasoning is not a new phenomenon. Hilaire Belloc noticed it in England in the 1920s when he wrote that if anyone, quote, exposed a financial swindler who happened to be a Jew, he was an anti-Semite. If he exposed a group of parliamentarians taking money from the Jews, he was an anti-Semite. If he did no more than call a Jew, he was an anti-Semite, end quote. Dr. E. Michael Jones continues on this question. If anything, he writes, what Belloc said then is a fortiori true today. Calling a Jew may or may not be prima facie evidence of anti-Semitism, but criticizing a group of people as Jews is regularly taken as such evidence. This is because it indicates that the group exists, that it has definable beliefs, parentheses, at least in many contexts, end parentheses, and that it can, therefore, act in a certain way and can even be criticized for acting. All of this does not change the fact that the main task confronting anyone who decides to write about the Jews is to define precisely what he means by that term. It is precisely in the manipulation of the term, quote, Jew, end quote, that its political benefits lie. He goes on, since the term Jew actually gets used with some frequency, its use is determined by the political advantage of those who use it. Thus, it is permissible in some circles to use the group designation when Jews are victims of some attack, but any reference to Jews as the perpetrators of some attack, again, ipso facto evidence of anti-Semitism and also a sign of conspiracy mania as well. It's heads I win, tails you lose. So again, according to another variation of the canons of contemporary discourse, it is permissible to say that Jews played a large role in the civil rights movement, but it would be anti-Semitic to say that they played a large role in the abortion rights movement. So we're going to keep going. Dr. E. Michael Jones writes, the term, in a section called The Term Jew Defined, he writes, the Christian then holds that the Jewish people have a perduring role and are at least in part defined by their refusal of the new covenant and by their relationship to Abraham and his, quote, seed, end quote. In order to discuss who counts as a Jew, it might be helpful to offer a working definition. We might say that there is a disjunctive positive component, a person who is related by birth or conversion to those similarly related by birth or conversion to Abraham, and a negative component, a person who has not renounced Judaism by embracing another faith, parentheses, especially Christianity, end quote. So EMJ writes, the renowned Jewish scholar Jacob Neusner makes clear a distinction between Judaists and Jews when he says, quote, the ethnic group does not define the religious system. All Judaists, those who practice a religion, Judaism, are Jews. But not all Jews are Judaists. That is to say, all those who practice the religion Judaism by definition fall into the ethnic group, the Jews, but not all members of the ethnic group practice Judaism. So, EMJ takes that information and he breaks it down. He writes, without knowing it, Neusner is simply restating the thesis of this book. When Judaism rejected Christ, it rejected Logos as well. And rejecting Christ, Judaism took on a negative identity, something that many Jews have realized at one time or another. Such enmity, Dr. E. Michael Jones writes, to Logos is represented in the person of Jesus Christ is present in the Talmud. Princeton Jewish scholar Peter Schaeffer notes that Talmudic stories mock claims of Jesus' birth from the Virgin Mary, challenge his claim to be the Messiah, and state that he was rightly executed for blasphemy and idolatry, and that he resides in hell where his followers will go. Schaeffer makes a starting claim that rather than being ill-informed and ephemeral, parts of the Babylonian Talmud betray a remarkably high level of familiarity with the Gospels, especially Matthew and John, and represent a deliberate and sophisticated anti-Christian polemic. The Talmud, E. Michael Jones writes, the Talmud admits the central role of Jesus in salvation, history, in a number of significant, if indirect ways. He writes, the Talmud might be said to be referring in some mysterious way to Christ's own words in John 15:18-25, quote, they hated me without a cause, end quote. The Talmud, in other words, quote, is exhibiting a gift of prophecy, stating a profound truth that unknowingly confirms Jesus' identity as the Messiah, although unaware of that fact, end quote. EMJ continues, quote, Judaism celebrates the, quote, Jews, end quote, identity, their origins, their history, and their past, and anyone who questions one of these elements, as Jesus does, is a threat to that identity. EMJ goes on, let's continue to define this word. He writes, Christianity is intimately connected with Christ. Judaism is just as intimately connected with Jerusalem. The, quote, Judaism in question takes on an official character. It has its seat in Jerusalem, and it is hostile to Jesus, end quote. It is, quote, le principal accusateur, end quote, of Jesus. Its headquarters is in Jerusalem, where all confrontations between Christ and, quote, the Jews, end quote, occur. It is the center of the, quote, systemic hostility of Judaism, end quote, against Jesus. EMJ writes, St. John mentions this systemic hostility in describing the man born blind but healed by Jesus. Word of the miracle spread, but, quote, the Jews would not believe that the man had been blind and gained his sight, end quote. To confirm, parentheses, or discredit, end parentheses, the story, the, quote, Jews, end quote, sent for the man's parents, parentheses, who like the man were Jewish, end parentheses, who were intimidated, refusing to speak, quote, out of fear of the Jews who had already agreed to expel from the synagogue anyone who should acknowledge Jesus as the Christ, end quote. We're going to keep digging. So EMJ writes, the claim that Jesus was the, quote, Son of Man, end quote, required a decision by the Jews. In John 7:11, we read that, quote, at the festival, the Jews were on the lookout for him. Where is he? They said. People stood in groups whispering about him. Some said, he is a good man. Others, no, he is leading the people astray. Yet no one spoke about him openly for fear of the Jews, end quote. EMJ writes, the meaning of, quote, Jew, end quote, in this context is clear. A, quote, Jew, end quote, is openly hostile to Christ and willing to persecute those Jews who accept him as the Messiah. John's mention of, quote, fear of the Jews, end quote, indicates that Jews were then afraid of, quote, Jews, end quote. The well-being of the Jews who accepted Christ was threatened by the Jews who rejected him. The parents of the man born blind exhibit, quote, fear of the Jews, end quote, because the, quote, Jews, end quote, threatened to expel followers of Jesus, also Jews, from the synagogue. The identity of both groups was essentially religious, not ethnic. Both identities were a function of Christ. The Jews who acknowledged Christ were expelled from the synagogue. The Jews who rejected him, the people John calls, quote, the Jews, end quote, defined themselves by that rejection. E. Michael Jones writes, unsatisfied by the parents' evasions, the, quote, Jews sent for the man, end quote, to question him themselves. They ask him leading questions and tell him to, quote, give glory to God, end quote, by testifying against Jesus because, quote, for our part, we know that this man is a sinner, end quote. The man refuses to be intimidated by, quote, the Jews, end quote. Quote, I only know, quote, he responds, quote, that I was blind and now I can see, end quote. When, quote, the Jews, end quote, want him to repeat his story, presumably to catch him in contradictions, the man refuses. Quote, I have told you once and you wouldn't listen. Why do you want to hear it all again? Do you want to become his disciples too? End quote. This outrages, quote, the Jews, end quote, who respond indignantly, quote, we are disciples of Moses, end quote. EMJ continues. At another point, Jesus rejects their claim to be disciples of Moses. In John 5:45, Joseph tells the, quote, Jews, end quote, do not imagine that I am going to accuse you before the Father. You place your hopes on Moses, and Moses will be your accuser. If you really believed him, you would believe me too, since it was I that he was writing about. But if you refuse to believe what he wrote, how can you believe what I say? Book review. And we're going to keep going here. So EMJ writes, the arrival of Jesus, according to St. John, is the defining moment for all Jews. He brings a radical discontinuity in history, too, for those who claim to be followers of Moses are not what they claim to be. They are, in fact, the opposite. In rejecting Christ, they reject Moses and everything Moses stood for. The term, quote, law, end quote, usually used in the same context as Moses, the lawgiver, is also deceptive. Jesus refused to admit that, quote, the Jews, end quote, are true to the law of Moses. Instead, he refers repeatedly to, quote, the Jews, end quote, as following, quote, their law, end quote, or, quote, your law, end quote. As Karen says, quote, the term law does not refer in this case to the law of Moses or to the writings of Moses, but rather to the law of the Jews or that of the Pharisees. The Jews are not faithful to the former, but rather to their own law. Or put another way, to false interpretation of the law of Moses, end quote. The official Judaism of Jerusalem thus is not what it pretends to be. Judaism is not Judaism at all, but rather what Karen calls, quote, un pseudo-Judaisme, end quote. I can't pronounce that. The, quote, Jews, end quote, are faithful to, quote, their law, end quote, not the law of Moses. All right, things are going to get more spicy as we continue to define the term Jew, and so we're going to keep going. If you haven't already, definitely smash that like button. Finally said it for the first time. Definitely give this video a like, comment, and subscribe to my channel for more great book reviews like this. If you haven't checked out my book reviews already, I encourage you to do so. I've done a number of E. Michael Jones book reviews that I encourage you to check out as well. And let me know what you think. So E. Michael Jones writes, what is true about Moses vis-a-vis the, quote, Jews, end quote, who claim him as their father is also a fortiori true about Abraham. As the discussion of spiritual parentage moves from chapter 5 to chapter 8, the terms become more intimate. Instead of talking about the law, the, quote, Jews talk, end quote, talk about, quote, sperma, end quote, or the biological inheritance of their status as the chosen people. In both cases, there is a radical discontinuity in history. Or to put another way, the continuity is not what it seems. Those who accept Christ are the children of Abraham and Moses. Those who call themselves, quote, Jews, end quote, are liars. EMJ writes, St. John was a Jew. More precisely, St. John was a Jew, but not, quote, a Jew, end quote. According to Overbeck, quote, the author of the fourth gospel, quote, is, quote, not a pagan Christian. He is instead a Hellenistic Jew, end quote. Why then does St. John refer to the, quote, Jews, end quote, as an alien, quote, they, end quote, determined to kill Christ? EMJ asks. EMJ writes, the answer again revolves around the meaning of the word. It evolves in the gospel. John begins by describing Jesus' encounter with the Samaritan woman. Jesus tells the woman, you worship what you do not know. We worship what we do know. EMJ explains, this dichotomy is simple. Jesus is a Jew. The Samaritan woman is not. The distinction is important because, as Jesus says, quote, salvation comes from the Jews, end quote. His declaration seems straightforward. The Jews are an ethnic group that is God's chosen people. From this group, salvation will come. Then, as if to complicate things, Jesus adds, the hour will come, is in fact already here, when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. EMJ writes, now that Jesus has arrived, the categories, quote, Jew, end quote, and, quote, true worshipers, end quote, are no longer synonymous. Salvation comes from the Jews, i.e. from an ethnic group that calls itself the chosen people. Upon Christ's arrival, however, the situation changes, for the Jews have to accept Christ to remain Israel. The Jews have to accept Christ to become, quote, true worshipers, end quote, who, quote, will worship the Father in spirit and truth, end quote. EMJ writes, the full implication of his cryptic message to the Samaritan woman only becomes apparent, however, when Jesus confronts the Jews, and in this confrontation, the meaning of the word, quote, Jew, end quote, also becomes apparent. John uses the term, quote, Jew, end quote, two ways. He begins by saying that, quote, salvation comes from the Jews, end quote, and ends by saying those who call themselves, quote, Jews, end quote, are not children of Abraham or Moses, and in fact have Satan as their father. From identifying the word Jew with, quote, we, end quote, as he does with the Samaritan woman, Jesus goes on to refer to what John calls, quote, Jews, end quote, as, quote, you, end quote, which is to say a group that does not include Jesus. Accepting or rejecting the Messiah becomes the principal way of defining what it means to be a Jew, end quote. EMJ writes, John makes this clear in chapter 8. The discussion between progressively more heated, leading to an irreparable break between Jesus and, quote, the Jews, end quote, when Jesus says to, quote, them, end quote, i.e., quote, the Jews, end quote, I am going away. You will look for me, and you will die in your sin. Where I am going, you cannot come. EMJ writes, the Jews become confused, wondering, will he kill himself? But Jesus indicates that a great division already exists. The, quote, Jews, end quote, can no longer be referred to as a, quote, we, end quote, that includes Jesus, but rather as, quote, you, end quote, as a group that does not include Christ because it rejected him. Quote, you, end quote, Christ continues referring to, quote, the Jews, end quote, are from below. I am from above. You are of this world. I am not of this world. So EMJ breaks this down some more. The issue of what it means to be a, quote, Jew, end quote, thus can only be resolved by resolving the issue of Christ's identity. Christ is the antithesis of sin. Those who reject Christ will die in their sins. Quote, I have told you already, end quote. Christ tells, quote, the Jews, end quote, quote, you will die in your sins, end quote. The, quote, Jews, end quote, redefine themselves by rejecting Christ as the Messiah. They propose false dichotomies, Moses versus Jesus, Abraham versus Jesus, which became nonetheless the essential defining characteristic of what it meant to be a, quote, Jew, end quote. Thus the term, quote, Jew, end quote, is slowly redefined throughout the Gospel of St. John until by the end of the Gospel it means something different from what it meant at the beginning. This new meaning necessitates the awkward use of quotation marks when the term, quote, Jew, end quote, is used. With Christ's arrival and the annunciation of his ministry as, quote, the Son of Man, end quote, the term, quote, Jew, end quote, has either a completely and exclusively ethnic meaning, i.e., one shorn of any notion of chosenness, or it has a completely and exclusively theological meaning. Quote, Jew, end quote, is someone who rejects Christ and as a result will die in his sins. EMJ writes, after the Jews rejected Christ, Judaism ceased being a religion and became an ideology. Or to say the same thing another way, it went from being a true religion, parentheses, in fact the only true religion, end parentheses, to being a false religion, like Islam, Mormonism, Scientology, etc. In spite of the fact that it still claimed the inspired word of God as its foundational texts, Israel simultaneously lost its biological basis. The new Israel, the true children of Moses and Abraham, was now the church. End quote. We're going to keep on going on our quest to define the word and the term Jew. EMJ continues. Jesus, however, changed the term from, quote, sperma to, end quote, to techna, end quote, which is to say from DNA or, quote, seed, end quote, to, quote, children, end quote. When the Jews repeat, quote, our father is Abraham, end quote, Jesus replies, if you were Abraham's children, you would do as Abraham did. EMJ writes, once Jesus denies the Jews salvation through their DNA, or through their version of keeping the law, their differences become irreconcilable, and violence becomes inescapable. The, quote, Jews, end quote, feel Jesus is casting aspersions on their parents. Quote, "We were not born of prostitution," unquote. They exclaim as anger builds. Jesus then pours gasoline on the fire. Quote, "If you were Abraham's children," unquote, Jesus tells them, casting their heritage in doubt, "you would do as Abraham did. As it is, you want to kill me. When I tell you the truth, as I have learned it from God, that is not what Abraham did." EMJ writes, "The anger of the Jews and the truth of Christ collide, and out of the collision comes the new definition of what it means to be a, quote, Jew, unquote. Quote, "What you are doing," quote, Christ tells the, quote, Jews, quote, "is what your father does," unquote. The, quote, Jews, unquote, sensing further insult, claim, quote, "We are not born of prostitution," end quote. But their biologism is besides the point. EMJ writes, "A child of God is not known by his DNA or sperma, but by what he does," as the, quote, Jews, end quote, themselves would have to admit. The, quote, Jews, end quote, claim to have God as their father, but their actions indicate the opposite. Quote, "If," end quote, Jesus reminds them, quote, "God were your father, you would love me," end quote. Since the, quote, Jews, end quote, do not love Christ, God is not their father. Either his interlocutors are Jews or Christ is a Jew, but according to St. John, both cannot be members of the same group. Indeed, they don't even speak the same language. Quote, "Do you know why you cannot take in what I say?" End quote. Christ asks the, quote, Jews, end quote. Quote, "It is because you are unable to understand my language." End quote. Then chapter 8 reaches its crisis. The, quote, Jews, end quote, are not children of God. Their father is Satan. Quote, "The devil," end quote, Jesus tells the, quote, Jews, end quote, "is your father, and you prefer to do what your father wants." So we're going to keep going on. EMJ writes, "The Jews are transformed by their encounter with Christ. Those who accept him become the new Israel known as the church. They are the true, quote, children, end quote, of Abraham and Moses. Those who reject Christ become the, quote, Jews, end quote, or followers of Satan. The, quote, Jew, end quote, whose father is Satan, quote, a murderer and a liar from the beginning, end quote, defines himself by rejecting Christ and truth. At that moment, Israel ceases to be an ethnic designation." So we're almost full circle here with this term. So EMJ writes, "What then are the, quote, Jews," end quote? In Revelations 2:9, John defends the nascent Christian community against the, quote, Jews, end quote, by reporting that, quote, "the slanderous accusations," end quote, against the Christians, quote, "have been made by people who profess to be Jews, but are really members of the synagogue of Satan," end quote. He revisits the theme in Revelation 3:9, referring to, quote, "the synagogue of Satan," end quote, as, quote, "those who profess to be Jews but are liars because they are no such thing," end quote. The angel visiting the beleaguered Christian community in Philadelphia will compel the, quote, Jews, end quote, to, quote, "fall at your feet and admit that you are the people that I love," end quote. Just as the, quote, Jews, end quote, who rejected Christ have a new name, quote, "the synagogue of Satan," end quote, so the group of Jews which accepted him, now enlarged by Gentile converts, will hence be known as, quote, "the new Jerusalem, which comes down from my God in heaven," end quote. EMJ writes, "Christ's coming brought about what Wankst terms, quote, a turning point in both religious economies," end quote. The church is now the true Israel, and the, quote, "the people who profess to be Jews and end quote, are in reality liars and members of the, quote, synagogue of Satan, end quote. Once the term, quote, Jew, end quote, is redefined, no further dialogue or compromise is possible. Jesus tells the, quote, Jews, end quote, your father is Satan, end quote. And they repay the favor by determining to kill him. A decision which, Karen says, quote, confirms in dramatic fashion the diabolical identity of the Jews, end quote. So the idea, so clearly this triggered a lot of Jews, right? The idea that the Gospels are anti-Semitic is not true. Jesus was a Jew. His apostles were Jews. This idea that it's somehow some sort of a race thing they're all lies. None of that is true. And so this term is fundamentally a theological concept, and it has to do with someone who rejects Christ, right? And it has to do with the way they carry themselves and how they behave, right? And the idea that the Gospels are, again, anti-Semitic or is it doesn't surprise me, because I think if I was blinded and I was in the darkness and a whole group of people are being identified in a certain negative way, I think I would want to find out why. Like, why are certain people, why are my people have all these negative characteristics? What is it about these negative characteristics that are causing other people to notice some things about a certain group of people? And that would be good, because then, if you're a representative of that community, maybe you could do things to not do that anymore, to not piss other people off, right? And maybe you could be a better member of that community. The second you try to pull in race, understand that you're being manipulated. There you go. You believe what you want, read what you want. Again, it's all in the book of the Gospel of St. John. And again, I got this information from the book, The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit, written by Dr. E. Michael Jones. I highly encourage you check that out. But I'm using those two sources as my sourcing for what it means as far as defining the term the Jew. Right, so now that we have defined the term the Jew, we're going to continue with this book review and sharing some things that stood out for me. And so one thing that was pretty cool about this book is I finally got to learn more about this Marcus Garvey, right? I've seen his imagery typically with the communist group Rage Against the Machine back in the 90s, right? I didn't know anything about politics or what the hell they were talking about. When I heard lyrics like when you murdered X, you try to blame it on Islam, and I was thinking to myself, oh yeah, like, who are these people? Who are these sort of figures, right? These associated with revolution, right? Who are they? And again, not a supporter of Rage Against the Machine anymore. Haven't been for years. There's some tracks that I liked in the 90s and I grew up with. I mean, but yeah, they're all full of shit. Like they're all communist bastards otherwise. But anyway, so going back to the book though, it was cool because I got to learn about some of these figures like Malcom X and Marcus Garvey. And so I'm going to share that with you through this book. So the author writes, Garvey delivered a message of economic self-sufficiency that would prove to be enduring importance to blacks. The UNIA, under Garvey's leadership, developed a black shipping line, black cooperative housing, black restaurants, and black laundries. He gave millions of blacks a sense of dignity and self-worth. It was no accident that Garvey's biographer, Edmund D. Cronin, gave his book the title Black Moses. So, the author writes, in stronger terms than anyone before him, Garvey preached black pride and black power. He told blacks who were ashamed of their color that black was beautiful. Indeed, he argued not for black equality, but black superiority. He writes, the author writes, like Washington and some other black figures, Garvey seemed preoccupied with Jews and Judaism. His call for an African exodus bore a striking similarity to the ideas of Jewish thinkers like Pinsker and Herzl, as well as to those of earlier black figures. In July 1920, Garvey told a UNIA meeting, quote, "A new spirit, a new courage has come to us simultaneously as it has come to other peoples of the world. It came to us at the same time as it came to the Jew. When the Jew said, 'We shall have Palestine,' the same sentiment came to us when we said, 'We shall have Africa.'" The author writes, but Garvey also believed that Jews blocked black progress. He quarreled frequently with the NAACP, and more often than not, his grievances concerned the leadership roles of Jews in what he believed should have been an all-black organization. Thus, where Washington had called upon blacks to emulate Jewish thrift and discipline, Garvey urged them to boycott Jewish businesses. For blacks to create their own enterprises, Garvey believed they needed to replace Jewish ones. For some of his arguments became an article of faith. Over time, the, quote, "buy black," end quote, campaigns he sparked in Harlem and elsewhere took on an overtly anti-Semitic tone. So it's going to get a little bit more interesting with this Marcus Garvey. We're going to continue. The author writes, Garvey's anti-Semitism intensified in 1922 after his conviction for mail fraud in a case involving the Black Star Steamship Line, an enterprise he had founded. Presiding Judge Julian Mack was a member of the German Jewish aristocracy who also served on the board of the NAACP. Judge Mack rejected Garvey's plea for a mistrial, fined him, and sentenced him to 5 years in prison, and denied him bail. Not surprisingly, Garvey's subsequent denunciation of Jews were as vitriolic as Tom Watson's had been in the Leo Frank trial, which we'll go over a little bit later. The author writes, citing an, quote, international frame-up, end quote, Garvey declared, quote, "I am being punished for the crime of the Jew Silverstone, an agent for the line." That's in brackets. He continues, "I was prosecuted by Maxwell Mattock, another Jew, and I am to be sentenced by Judge Julian Mack. The eminent Jewish jurist. Truly, I may say, I was going to Jericho and fell among thieves." End quote. His second wife, Amy Jacques, bitterly assailed Jews in the April 28, 1923 issue of Negro World. Her article was entitled, quote, "Who is to be blamed?" End quote. She blamed the Jews. Meanwhile, Garvey's other followers continued their attack on what they termed the parasitical presence of Jews in black ghettos. So the story continues about Mr. Marcus Garvey. The author writes, after serving 2 years, Garvey was deported in 1927. In London, he launched a new publication to promote his views on Negro separatism, The Black Men, which gave him an outlet for his rage against Jews, particularly those who particularly those engaged in international finance. During these years, Garvey also became an avowed admirer of Adolf Hitler, likening the charismatic Führer's intense nationalism and dream of a greater Germany to his own call for a greater Africa. The Black Man wrote, quote, "Hitler's ways could make the Negro man he ought to be." End quote. Garvey warned in 1935, before the Nazis' persecution of Jews had gained widespread public notice, that the Jews would ultimately destroy Germany, as they had already destroyed Russia. On the other hand, he frequently complimented Jews for their strong attachment to Zionism and their efforts to obtain a Jewish state. End quote. So for this fourth passage that stood out to me, this one has to do with the chapter called The 30s. And here we go. Murray Friedman writes, early in 1933, Harlem tenement dwellers threatened to continue a rent strike until increases were rescinded and janitorial services improved. When a judge ruled in favor of the strikers, the following year, the strike spread, and a number of landlords were forced out of business because of rising costs. In the spring of Harlem street corners began to resound to the rhetoric of a series of anti-Semitic soapbox orators. One of the most radical was a turban Muslim from Chicago named Sufi Abdul Hamid. In Chicago, Sufi's exotic dress and his claim to have been divinely ordained by Muhammad to redeem the city's south side from Jewish merchants gained him a certain notoriety. In New York, his racist message lost none of its punch. Identifying himself as the Black Hitler and a man that the Jews were terrified of, he urged his listeners to run Jews out of Harlem. In a manner Louis Farrakhan would make familiar many years later, Sufi attacked what he termed Zionist colonialists and the Jews in Washington who rule everything. End quote. In order to describe the current state of the Biden administration, we'll look no further than the May 2023 issue of Culture Wars magazine, in which, in one of the articles, Dr. E. Michael Jones writes, one of the main Jewish preoccupations is worrying about going out of existence. Following in the footsteps of Alan Dershowitz, who wrote The Vanishing American Jew 26 years ago, Dominic Green wrote in The Jewish Chronicle that, quote, suddenly, everywhere you look, Jews are disappearing, end quote. As one proof of his claim, Green states that under Biden, the percentage of Jewish judicial appointees has dropped from the historical norm of 20% to 8 to 9%. In his rush to tell us that the sky is falling, Green neglected to tell us in controlling 20% of the judiciary, the Jews are massively overrepresented in how the laws of this country gets enforced. Ignoring the fact that Jews make up only 2% of the population, Green more importantly claims that Jews are disappearing from the, quote, the upper echelons, end quote, at the very moment when Biden's West Wing has enough Jews to constitute a minyan, the number of Jews required to hold a prayer service at a synagogue. As Jason Kornbluh pointed out in the foreword, as President-elect Joe Biden announced his picks for the cabinet, the joke went around Jewish Twitter that the West Wing would have a minyan. Indeed, at least 10 prominent Jews have been nominated to key positions. There's Ronald Klain, Chief of Staff, Anthony Blinken, Secretary of State, Janet Yellen, Treasury, Merrick Garland, Attorney General, Alejandro Mayorkas, Homeland Security, and Avril Haines, Director of National Intelligence. One level down are Wendy Sherman, Deputy Secretary of State, Eric Lander, Science and Technology Advisor, Ann Neuberger, Deputy National Security Advisor, and David Cohen, Deputy CIA Director. EMJ writes, shortly after Biden's inauguration, the Virtual Jewish Library published a list of 46 Jews in the Biden administration, making it clear that there were enough Jews in the Biden administration to form an entire congregation, end quote. So again, I do think the book is well written. I learned a lot, but I also learned, and I was quite annoyed by these two pervasive lies that I saw in this book. And it's one that there's a racial component to the Jewish identity being white, And the second thing, which anytime any comparison to Christianity and Nazism is detestable. It's awful. What happens is Murray Friedman, he makes that comparison, and he writes, an admirer of Haj Amin el-Husseini, an Arab ally of Hitler and Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Sufi openly courted the German-American Bund and the Nazi-like Christian Front. That's super annoying. I will always denounce Nazism, and that sort of thing should be condemned. And it's unfortunate, but people are going to do what they want to do, and people will deviate from the Word of God and do what they want. And so there you go. The next bit, I've already lost track of numbers, but for the next bit, we're going to get into Leo Frank, the story of Leo Frank. And if you haven't heard the story of Leo Frank, I encourage you to look it up and read for yourself and see what you think of it. But so now I bring up this story because it'll be interesting to see what he had to say from the perspective from the lens of a Jewish writer about that episode in history. And so we'll get started. So Murray Friedman, he writes, a defining moment in the partnership between blacks and Jews occurred with the Leo Frank case, an episode whose painful ambivalence symbolizes the complexity of this alliance from its outset to the present day. Listen to how he writes this. A Jew convicted by a black man's testimony set blacks and Jews against each other. Yet paradoxically, the lynching of Leo Frank caused the two groups to identify more closely with one another. Saturday, April 26, 1913, Confederate Memorial Day, was a holiday throughout the South. But Leo Frank, a Jew, that's my clarification, manager of the National Pencil Company's plant in Atlanta, had gone to work anyway. The factory was closed and save for an office boy and janitor, Frank was alone when an employee named Mary Fagan, a white Southern girl of humble parentage, came in to pick up her wages. She was just 13 years old. Young for a factory worker even then, but she would get no older. At 3 o'clock the next morning, her bludgeoned body was found face down on a slag heap in the plant's basement. The author writes, one day later, Atlanta police arrested Leo Frank for the murder of Mary Fagan. His accuser was the janitor James Conley, who said Frank had ordered him to conceal the girl's body in the basement after admitting he had killed her when she resisted his advances. Interesting stuff. As always, you make your own decisions. But the story thickens. The author writes, Frank denied the charges. It was his word against Conley's, the word of a white supervisor against a poor black laborer who had previously served time in prison for petty thievery. In the South of 1913, there was no precedent for a conviction under such circumstances, but Leo Frank was not a white Southerner. He was a Brooklyn Jew, a northern transplant who had married into a prominent Jewish family in Atlanta and president of the city's B'nai and Bereth Lodge. Trigger warning, things are going to get spicy as I quote this. So Murray writes, the trial was a mob scene, as angry cries of, quote, death to the Jew, end quote, from white militants outside the courthouse reverberated within earshot of the judge and jury. In this explosive atmosphere, Leo Frank's lawyers responded to the intemperate outbursts of Georgia's powerful populist leader, Tom Watson, parentheses, who in his weekly Jeffersonian magazine repeatedly demanded the execution of the, quote, filthy, perverted Jew of New York, end quote, parentheses, end parentheses, with attacks of their own on the key prosecution witness. Quote, who is this man, James Conley, end quote. Black, drunken, lying, end quote. Frank also wondered how the, quote, testimony of Southern white women of unimpeachable character, quote, end quote, who spoke on his behalf could be disbelieved while the, quote, perjured vaporings of a black brute alone, brackets, could be, end brackets, accepted as the whole truth, end quote. The author goes on, listen to this. On August 23, 1913, Leo Frank was convicted of killing Mary Fagan. In the trial's aftermath, Watson, exploiting local distrust and dislike of both Jews and capitalists, continued to denounce Leo Frank as a member of the, quote, Jewish aristocracy, end quote. And he accused, quote, rich Jews, end quote, of determining that, quote, no aristocrat of their race should die for the death of a working class Gentile, end quote. Worried about the hysteria being generated, the nation's Jewish community mobilized behind the condemned man, hoping to upset the verdict on appeal. By his own account, Albert Lasker, the noted advertising executive, spent $100,000 in personal funds and took a year from his agency to rally support for Frank. Just think about that for a second. $100,000 for in 1913 money. So that's real money, right? None of this stuff where we just print money and whatever. Real money, all for that racehorse of Leo Frank. That's something. We're going to keep going on in the Leo Frank story. Murray writes, as Frank's attorney in the appeal effort, Louis Marshall, president of the American Jewish Community, attacked James Conley's credibility, James Conley again being the black janitor, and argued that rabble-rousing prosecution tactics in Atlanta had deprived his client of a fair trial. Marshall brought the case to the attention of Adolph Oakes, publisher of the New York Times, which editorialized in favor of Frank and labeled Conley a, quote, black monster, end quote. Without naming the janitor, the Washington Post went even further, declaring that the brutal murder appeared to be, quote, characteristic of a drunken, ignorant Negro, end quote. The Post was convinced that, quote, no intelligent white man would do such a thing, end quote. Whew. Spicy. But we're going to keep going. Murray writes, the Frank episode initially threatened the fledgling partnership between blacks and Jews. The New York Age was critical of Frank's supporters who sought to place the blame for Mary Fagan's murder on the black handyman. The black-owned Chicago Defender, in a manner reminiscent of the Amsterdam News, headline, quote, many blacks, no Jews arrested in Crown Heights, end quote, of almost 80 years later declared, quote, Jews raise millions to free Frank and put blame on innocent man, end quote. In the 2 years following the Frank trial, Marshall carried his appeals all the way to the Supreme Court. The author continues, with Justices Oliver Wendell Holmes and Charles Evans Hughes dissenting, the court denied a writ of error requested by Frank's lawyers, and his execution was subsequently scheduled for June 1915. Final appeals were made to Georgia's governor, John Slayton. Tom Watson, exercising his political muscle, pressured the governor to let the hanging proceed. Yet at the last minute, in an act of courage that would destroy his career, Slayton commuted the sentence to life imprisonment. Frank's victory was short-lived, however. 2 months later, he was taken by angry whites from the prison where he was being held, carried to a field some miles away, and hanged. When I read this passage, the inherent racism from the author when it comes to black is thinly veiled. When I read the sentence, quote, a Jew convicted by a black man's testimony, end quote, to say that that's inflammatory with racism is an understatement. This is somebody who clearly thinks that they're way better than another person, another man, and it's just unrestrained pride in their identity. Okay, so the author has painted one heck of a picture about the whole Leo Frank trial, which was admirably written. But the author doesn't shy away from making his own conclusions about the actual trial. The author has determined, as he writes, Leo Frank did not kill Mary Fagan. His innocence was finally established in 1982 when Alonzo Mann, who had been Frank's office boy, admitted after 69 years of silence that he had seen Conley with the body of Mary Fagan in his arms on that day in April 1913. Mans, who was 83 when he finally cleared his conscience, said the janitor had threatened him with death, and so he had said nothing. With Mann's belated admission, the state of Georgia pardoned Leo Frank, and the case was declared closed. So, we have this story of this dead 13-year-old white girl who was advanced upon, the story goes, by the Jewish owner of the business. The Jewish owner, of course, blames someone else who was a black janitor. Okay? And now, later, now this happened around in 1913. Flash forward to the 80s, and all of a sudden, there's this clear up in history, right? A sort of rewriting of the history, exonerating Leo Frank from this murder charge. But who really knows? I mean, who really knows what happened? But the fun part is, that's for you to decide. Okay, so for this next part, we're going to start getting into a little bit of MLK and some of the 60s and about 60s, early 70s kind of vibe-ish time frame is where we are in this book now. And the chapter is called The Civil Rights Revolution and the Crisis of the Left. And now we're talking about Martin Luther King, and we're talking about what kind of people he rolled with, so to speak. And so we're going to get into it, and the author writes, Rustin prepared the way for Stanley David Levison, who now entered the scene. In the summer of 1956, with the boycott gaining momentum, Rustin introduced King to Levison, who would become King's closest white friend. Once again, we have a gross error in categorization when it comes to Jew and identifying it in racial terms as being white, which is not true, yet again is repeated a few times throughout the book. And Murray writes, as we have seen, Marshall was an establishment figure, one of the nation's most honored Jews. Levison was a political radical who had worked on behalf of the convicted atom spies Ethel and Julius Rosenberg, parentheses, who were executed in 1955, end parentheses, and in efforts to abolish the McCarran Act and other limitations on political expression. He writes, when Congress hounded American communists after World War II and passed laws to restrict their activities, Levison sprang to their defense. So in sharing that passage, we got a couple of things to kind of dissect. One, we went over the categorical mistake that there's a ethnic or racial component to the identity known as Jew. Mr. Levison is white, which is not true. I mean, he is highly lauded in this book for being an intellectual, being Martin Luther King's right-hand man, so to speak, being very close with his wife, and that's all great, but there are other sides of him to also take note with these things, right? And one of those things is this idea of being a political radical, right? Which is interesting because there's evidence of this sort of what EMJ would call the Jewish revolutionary spirit, right? And so it's interesting, but at the same time, not at all shocking that Jewish people with the revolutionary spirit that they have are at the center of so many revolutionary activities throughout history. Whether we're talking about, if we want to talk about countries, whether we're talking about Russia, Vietnam, or even this country. So, and then the last thing to notice is this sort of the defense of communism, which is diametrically opposed to freedom and liberty, right? Communism is associated with keeping people under surveillance, fear, some sort of a police state, right? You got families snitching on each other, neighbors snitching on each other so they can serve the oligarchs. Read the Gulag Archipelago. Read about Pol Pot. I know our culture is inundated with how bad those Nazis are, and they were, but absolutely communists are, and its whole history, starting with their Jewish leaders, Karl Marx and Lenin, all of communism the history is built on rivers of blood, torture, murder, corruption, the dissolution of governments. So to believe in communism is to promote communism is to promote evil on this world, and so that's also interesting. So I do think that to promote communism is essentially to promote evil, and so I think that to promote communism is to promote a sort of anti-human evil amongst this world, but it's sold under this guise of like, hey, equality, but really it's equality in misery, while we have to bootleg to commissars or oligarchs that really are about themselves and whatever they're trying to pursue. And for the everyday people, it would be hell on earth. I think E. Michael Jones really hits the nail on the head when he describes this whole thing as the Jewish revolutionary spirit, right? Revolution, right? We got the Beatles song Revolution. Let's start a revolution. That whole thing. What are we talking about so often? Who's the biggest revolutionary of all time? Satan. So when he said no to God and he wanted to do his own thing, he became the most pronounced revolutionary in history, right? But here are two more bits that I'm going to share with you about the Jewish revolutionary spirit. And once again, it's in the book, The Jewish Revolutionary Spirit, written by E. Michael Jones. And I'm just going to share with you a couple of the opening bits from the book, which is right as you open the book, some starting quotes. And one of them is from St. John Chrysostom in Adversus Judaeos, and he writes, "Yet what kind of men were they who set their hands to the task, brackets, of rebuilding the temple, end brackets? They were men who constantly resisted the Holy Spirit, revolutionists bent on stirring up sedition. After the destruction which occurred under Vespasian and Titus, these Jews rebelled during the reign of Hadrian and tried to go back to the old commonwealth and way of life. What they failed to realize was that they were fighting against the decree of God, who had ordered that Jerusalem remain forever in ruins." Here's another one. Pope Benedict XVI in Spes Salvi, he writes, "Christianity did not bring a message of social revolution like that of the ill-fated Spartacus, whose struggle led to so much bloodshed. Jesus was not Spartacus. He was not engaged in a fight for political liberation like Barabbas or Bar Kokhba. Jesus, who himself died on the cross, brought something totally different, an encounter with the Lord of all lords, an encounter with the living God, and thus an encounter with a hope stronger than the sufferings of slavery, a hope which therefore transformed life and the world from within." I'm going to add one more bit regarding the Jewish revolutionary spirit from the book. And Dr. E. Michael Jones writes, "The Jews rejected Christ because he was crucified. They wanted a powerful leader, not a suffering servant. Annas and Caiaphas mockingly told Christ that if he came down from the cross, they would accept him as the Messiah. When the Jews rejected Christ, they rejected Logos. And when they rejected Logos, which included within itself the principles of social order, they became revolutionaries." And so the next interesting thing I want to talk about that stood out from this book is talking about Malcolm X and learning about a little bit more about him. That's pretty cool. You know, I've always had an interest in him to some degree. I've listened to some of his stuff. I don't agree with all of it, but I always thought that he made some really good points. I think he was definitely taken from us way too soon. But his autobiography, back in like sometime after college, and I remember it being pretty good, and it was an interesting read too. So if you see that, you should check that out if you want to learn more about Malcolm X. But let's see what this author has to say about Malcolm X. So he writes, throughout most of his public career, though, Malcolm scorned King's philosophy of nonviolent protest and attacked King's tactics in civil rights demonstration as mealy-mouthed and worse, quote, any Negro who teaches other Negroes to turn the other cheek, end quote, he said of King, quote, is disarming the Negro, end quote. The author writes, like Garvey and other black nationalists, Malcolm denounced Jews as exploiters of blacks. At a meeting in 1959, he characterized them as among the worst of the devils. Jews, he wrote in his autobiography, were hypocrites, whose claim to be friends of the black man was intended only to focus the prejudice in America upon a Negro, thereby diverting it from themselves. The author writes, he called Jewish businessmen in Harlem colonialists and deeply resented them. 2 years later, he held an off-the-record meeting with Klan leaders, as in the KKK, in Atlanta, seeking their support for a Muslim effort to create a Muslim enclave in the United States. He told the Klansmen that the Muslims were as anxious to maintain segregation as the Klan. And according to an FBI report, he assured them it was Jews who were behind the integration movement. So we're going to keep going. Murray writes, Malcolm encouraged his followers to develop linkages with peoples of color in Africa and Asia, joining forces with the world's non-Caucasian majority. He also adopted the Muslim ideological and religious position toward Israel, namely that the Jews, with the help of American and European Christians, had stolen a centuries-old Muslim homeland and taken it for themselves. He charged that American aid to Israel was taken from the pockets of American blacks. The author writes, it was Malcolm, as Earl Rabb has pointed out, who more than anyone else put together all the third world pieces at home and abroad that would soon take root among the black intelligentsia and elsewhere. Jews, of course, especially those who had worked for civil rights, were furious at finding themselves condemned and indeed consigned to the wrong side of history. In 1966, after Malcolm's murder, a group of young California militants inspired by him and headed by Huey P. Newton and Bobby Seale organized the Black Panthers Party, which was prepared to defend blacks by force if necessary. Quote, we've never advocated violence. Violence is inflicted upon us, end quote. Newton told a reporter in June 1970 after a California court overturned his conviction for killing an Oakland police officer. However, he did advocate self-defense for himself and for black people generally. Eldridge Cleaver was even more confrontational. The choice before the country, he said, was complete freedom for black people or complete destruction for America. The author writes, writing of Malcolm X and Huey Newton in The Village Voice, black writer Stanley Crouch has described them as defending the downtrodden against the powerful. Certainly their disaffection was not surprising given the frequent indifference of the FBI and other law enforcement authorities to violations of civil rights statutes. But despite self-help breakfast programs of the Black Panthers, the gangster tendencies of these new forces were unmistakable, and their dissolution was well illustrated by the spectacle of Newton, some years later sitting in the Great Hall of China, snorting cocaine and raving unintelligibly. So the story of the Black Panthers and how they were killed by freaking government agents, a few of them, even in Chicago. It's a terrible history. That's a topic for another story. I can't promote violence, and I can see how a community being so pushed along the edge where they feel like, well, if nobody's going to protect us, we just have to protect our own, sort of thing. I can certainly understand that, but the idea of when we start talking about any kind of race being superior to another, I'm not going to support it, and no matter the injunction. That's all bullshit. That's all racist bullshit and narrative, and so be very careful when anytime there's a certain cause for a race, because as history has shown, it's we're ultimately working with men, and men are fundamentally corrupt. We can be corrupt, and which makes the whole thing the foundation of this whole noble endeavor and of civil rights to be fundamentally predisposed to a level of corruption because of man's inherent nature to succumb to sin and vice. And it sucks. I don't have the answers for it, but I do know that violence and some sort of any kind of racial superiority for any reason, not the way to go. And so now we're going to talk about this interesting part of the book, what has to do with Louis Farrakhan. And this was also another fun part of the book, because I know that to some degree that Jesse Jackson, I wasn't aware of some of his exploits and some of the things he said, which definitely rustled some jimmies. But I do know throughout living life, I've heard the name Louis Farrakhan, and I've listened to like one of his things here and there, and I could never fully agree with him, right? But that's for you to decide as well. This is a free country. If you feel like you want to listen to some of his stuff or Jesse Jackson, go for it. But let's see what the author says about Mr. Louis Farrakhan. He writes, "In the whole history of black-Jewish relations, there has never been a more divisive force than Louis Farrakhan, the calypso singer turned black Muslim leader. His message which has not changed much over the years, is decidedly mixed. On the one hand, he relentlessly sermonizes to blacks on the importance of education and family. On the one hand, he relentlessly sermonizes to blacks on the importance of education and family life, and warns about the dangers of drugs. He urges his followers not to count on government handouts, but to make their own way. In the racist, social, and economic system, he argues minorities must be self-reliant, because they can't expect help from any quarter. Such inspirational talks has won over many blacks who see in Farrakhan, tall, handsome, well-spoken, with his hair cut short and his suits conservatively tailored, a leader worth emulating. Many whites would cheer him too, were it not for the other side of Farrakhan's message. A harsh attack on white society, and particularly on the role of Jews in that society, for what Farrakhan sees as their cruel and constant exploitation of blacks. In the 1980s, he delivered this rebuke in cities and on college campuses from coast to coast, and his withering attacks seemed calculated to further the distance between blacks and Jews. In certain respects, his rhetoric was similar to that of Marcus Garvey in the 1920s and Malcom X in the 1960s. In part because of his close association with Jackson, as in Jesse Jackson. However, Farrakhan reached deeper into the black psyche, and his message was far more vitriolic, especially in his diatribes against Jews. Even worse in Jewish eyes was the fact that some 65% of the Jackson delegates at the 1984 Democratic National Convention indicated that they had a favorable view of him. In 1955, at the age of 22, he was recruited into the Nation of Islam by Malcom X. In 1964, following a pilgrimage to Mecca, Malcolm denounced the racist doctrines of the movement's founder, Elijah Muhammad. Shortly after that, Malcolm was assassinated in Harlem. Several days before the murder, Farrakhan called openly for Malcolm's death, but later denied responsibility for it. Interesting. So things are about to get spicy. Invariably, they were headed that way, and so we'll go on. Murray writes about Farrakhan. Farrakhan insisted that the Jewish people were not God's chosen people, predicted that once they attained true political power, 40 million blacks could wield as much influence as Jews now did. Speaking as head of the All-African People's Revolutionary Party, quote, redo, he further accused some black leaders in Los Angeles of bowing to pressure from Jews to repudiate him. Farrakhan's tour climaxed in New York, where on October 7th, an overflow crowd of almost 25,000 jammed Madison Square's garden. A, quote, rainbow coalition, end quote, of leaders warmed up the audience before Farrakhan's appearance. Speaking as head of the All-African People's Revolutionary Party, Kwame Ture, formerly Stokely Carmichael, called for war against Israel and recognition of the, quote, sacredness, end quote, of Africa. Said Arafat, a Palestinian, urged the total liberation of Palestine. Russell Means, a founder of the American Indian movement, after attacking white treatment of Native Americans, charged that the Jews in Hollywood, quote, did a number on Mr. Farrakhan, end quote, adding that this was how Hollywood had treated every non-white race and people. Murray writes, when 5 hours later Farrakhan finally took the lectern, he confronted his accusers head-on. He told the throng that Edward I. Koch, parentheses, then running for a third term as mayor of New York, end parentheses, Governor Mario Cuomo, and some local black leaders whom he described as, quote, pitiful, end quote, had called him a lot of ugly names. He said that such words only served to make him fight harder. At one point in the evening, while rhetorically asking who was ranged against him, he directly linked the enemies of Farrakhan with the enemies of Jesus. And who were these? Quote, Jews, 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 end quote, shouted the crowd. The author continues regarding Farrakhan. Farrakhan's appeal was not limited to working class and inner city blacks. He also aroused great interest and a measure of support on many college campuses. Farrakhan and Kwame Ture gave frequent campus lectures in which they continued to condemn Zionist Jews. Ture inflamed black-Jewish relations, for example, in two 1986 speeches on the campus of the University of Maryland and College Park. In one, he told the campus audience, quote, the only good Zionist is a dead Zionist, end quote. And, quote, we must take a lesson from Hitler, end quote. Jewish students picketed the affair and lodged a complaint with the National Association for Advancement of Colored People, since its campus unit had co-sponsored Tory's appearance with the Black Student Union. A riot erupted at the second speech when some 20 Jewish students broke through a police blockade to enter the lecture hall. After Torrey addressed a capacity audience at the State University of New York at Albany, a Jewish student confronted him. Describing himself as a Zionist, the student noted that the Torrey had often said that the only good Zionist was a dead Zionist. Did that mean that Torrey wished him and his Zionist friends dead? Without hesitation, Torrey answered yes, amid great applause. Okay, if you made it this far to the book review and you've watched, thank you so much for watching. I really do commend you. Definitely like the video and comment. You've made it this far, and thanks for sticking with me. But I'm gonna leave this book review with two last thoughts from the book, and that I think summarizes it fairly well, and I pretty much agree with it. So here we go. The author Murray Friedman writes, in the epilogue, Beyond the Black-Jewish Alliance, he writes, in retrospect, we could see that the civil rights battles of the 1960s marked the high point of the Black-Jewish Alliance. In that period, blacks and Jews labored together in common cause, and often at great risk, to end Americans' version of apartheid. Racist statuettes were struck down throughout the South. It was a remarkable achievement, and those who joined the struggle did, in fact, quote, overcome end quote, state-ordered racism. And I agree with this final part. Once upon a time, the author writes, Jews and blacks together wrote some of the finest pages in that story, shedding their blood to redeem the promise of American life. That is a fact, and it should not be forgotten. You know, so say what you will about this book. I highly recommend it. What Went Wrong? The Creation and Collapse of the Black-Jewish Alliance. Nice little read from 1995. And there's some interesting things to consider and a lot of things to kind of contemplate, and especially how it's almost uncanny, some of the things that are being said and how it relates to modernity now and our present situation in this year of June 2023. And you know, you make up your own conclusions. You know, again, I've been saying this throughout the whole video. So there you have it. This has been a book review on the tales of What Went Wrong? The Creation and Collapse of the Black-Jewish Alliance, written by Murray Friedman. Pretty solid book. I got the hardcover of it. Love hardcovers. Came out in 95. Here's a picture of them. All right. And it's a solid read. And, you know, this sort of thing gives you the edge over people who don't know history, people who are willfully blind or are ignorant, but yet they want to speak about history, but they don't know anything aside from what they saw on a TikTok reel or a Facebook video or whatever. And so I always encourage the idea of you reading for yourself some of these pieces of knowledge and making up your own mind, as opposed to any kind of law telling you what you should believe, any kind of government saying this is what happened, believe this. You know, the proof is in the pudding. You do what you want with it, and there you go. You know, it's important that you read up on history. You know, you when people say certain things about what they did, the devil's in the details, right? And I think the devil being in the details of the civil rights movement or any kind of revolutionary movement, you're going to find the devil, and it's in the details. And it's interesting, right? And that's for you to make your own conclusions, draw up your own thoughts on it. But and that's great. That's what I want to promote. I don't think that any kind of censoring of information or rewriting information is the way to go, because and not only that, not only from a moral state, but it's also impossible, because the truth is so strong that it supersedes any of that, because there's a divine nature to the truth that cannot be denied and will not be denied. But again, that's all for you to decide. I really hope you watch this video throughout its duration, or at least listen to it. If you haven't done that, definitely do that. But definitely like the video, comment, and let me know what you think. Thanks again for watching. Peace.
Philosophy, they take for some history. Everyday people like you and me, you know.